Leanna Clausen, well, there can be no greater issue to trust God with than the world AIDS crisis. And in a moment, Jim Cantillon is going to be coming up to teach us about what is being done in the world, what we can do. But first, take a look at the current state of the crisis and the Christian community's response.
The horror of AIDS in the world today is beyond human comprehension. Experts say someone dies from the disease every 10 seconds, and in that same amount of time, 2 more people are infected. Nearly 25 million have died from AIDS, and 40 million are currently infected. No place on earth has been harder hit than the continent of Africa. Of the 40 million infected worldwide, 28 million live in its sub-Saharan region. In the tiny nation of Botswana alone, 1 out of every 3 people are infected. Growing beyond a health crisis, this pandemic has impacted every level of society, killing the educated and the skilled, and wiping out an entire generation. Economies are on the verge of collapse, and health and social systems can't even begin to cope. Perhaps worst of all, there are 13 million AIDS orphans, many of whom must fend for themselves, a number that's expected to double in the next 10 years. It's a disease for which there's no cure, no vaccine, and seemingly no hope. In light of this horror, the Christian aid organization Samaritan's Purse organized an international conference on AIDS in Washington, D.C. last week. More than 1,000 people from 82 countries gathered to formulate a Christian response to AIDS.
And really what I would like to see come as a result of this is that God's people around the world are challenged to get out, to get involved, and to put the issues that are divisive about AIDS behind them and move on to the ministry of AIDS, to move on to extending the compassion and the love of Christ to people everywhere in the world, to be involved in programs of prevention and education that promote abstinence and monogamy. But at the same time, I think judgment is God's. Judgment is not up to us. And I believe that that has been a real stumbling block for the Christian church. And that is that most AIDS is spread through sexual contact, and there's moral issues. And those are real issues. Morals, there's sin in the world, and there's God's law. But again, I think that judgment is up to God, and we're called as Christians to grace, to love, to compassion, and to ministry. And I just hope that churches around the world move past the difficult issues and get on with the work at hand.
Okay, and Crossroads representative at that historic conference is Reverend Jim Cantillon of Vision-Led Ministries. Jim, thanks for tackling AIDS.
Well, I think that it's such a humongous challenge. It's the greatest challenge, really, that humankind has ever faced. That really you cannot not be involved. And I had a sense a few years ago this was something the Lord was calling me to do, and so really that's what I do. The IDI show is almost like a hobby for me. What I really do is commute to Africa and deal with this issue on the local church basis across about 8 countries now. And everywhere you go, Lorna, you saw some of the pictures there. It's just overwhelming. I have never seen anything like the graveyards.
Okay, so let me ask about that, because in the video world, we hunt and hunt and hunt for graveyard pictures, perhaps. Yeah. But you've walked in these countries, and you don't have to hunt for the pictures, do you?
Well, I was in Port Elizabeth just a few weeks ago, which is right down on the southern coast of South Africa, in a cemetery with an undertaker. And I was just kind of getting his input with regard to the incidence of funerals every weekend. They usually do them on Saturdays. And he said it's got so bad in the Port Elizabeth area, they're seriously considering burying people vertically because they're running out of space. Now, I've been in cemeteries throughout Africa where the traditional graveyard is now, where you have the nice, headstones and graves laid out. Between the old grave sites and at either end are new graves. And so literally you've got to walk over graves to get to graves. And that's just the way it is. And I've never seen anything like the 10, 15, 20 holes that are prepared for that day's funerals. In fact, Lorna, in that setup piece we had some statistics given, but let's just review some of those stats, friends, just so you have a sense of the situation. And these are the latest from UN AIDS. 40 million people are living with AIDS right now, and 28.1 million of them are in sub-Saharan Africa. To this point in time, we've had over 20 million die from HIV/AIDS, and 3.8 million kids are part of that figure under the age of 15. We've got a huge, awful war going on here right now, and we can't pretend that it's not happening. And a big part of the challenge is to help the church understand that this is not an issue to be condemning or to be righteous about, in the sense of we're holier than the person who has it. We've got to understand that it's no respecter of persons. Church people as well as not church people have it, and it's literally decimating Africa. You have a whole generation are being wiped out.
Okay, let's take a look then at, because you're number one, we're going to go all week through 4 different pillars. But Jim, you think it's really important we tackle the idea of awareness.
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely. Awareness is absolutely key. What I've discovered when I guess I've spoken in now about 60, 65 churches in the last 2 years, just in Africa. 95% of the time, it's the first time in that church that they've heard anything about HIV/AIDS from the pulpit. And the fact that I come 14,000 clicks, and speak with a North American accent works for me. Because
the first time they've heard
first
anything.
Time. Listen, I was speaking in Harare, Zimbabwe recently to a church of 800 people. After I finished, the pastor got up, direct quote, he said, "I want to thank Jim Cantelon for coming 14,000 kilometers to bring this urgent issue to our attention." And I'm saying, what? I almost thought he was joking. They don't want to talk about it. There's a real stigma about talking about things sexual, number one. But number two, they don't want to admit the possibility, let alone the reality, that some of their church people are contracting HIV/AIDS through promiscuous or extramarital sex.
All right, well, let's take a look at an honest examination of the awareness problem. Here's Listen Up's Denise Lottie.
There's no doubt AIDS is killing sub-Saharan Africa, home to 70% of young people living with AIDS and 90% of AIDS orphans. What's even worse, only a third know they're infected. Tragically, the very people who can help, the church, often act as though AIDS doesn't exist.
There's a real big barrier in the Setswana culture in that sex is something that is not talked about publicly in any forum. And it's not talked about in the church either. So how do you talk about HIV/AIDS without talking about sex? You have the two are linked. You have to talk about both. And there's often a resistance to that in the church. There's often a resistance to that in families. And so that's a real big issue that has to be overcome in order to be able to address the issue, the situation.
I think that people aim too high. They say nice words, but when it comes down to the practical stuff, how much do you know about sex? In fact, when I ask this question, very little people will stick their hands up and say that they are sexually active because they think it's not the place in a church to say that. Now, I asked that question specifically because how can you deal with HIV if you cannot talk about sex? And if you have if parents do not educate their children about sex, who will do this? What information will the children get? And so, as Christians, it's our responsibility to educate about sex as well. At least if the church is going to, let's forget about the word church, let's talk about Christians. If Christians can start talking openly about sex in a value-based way, then I think that will already help a lot.
We have a very famous case that's been a blessing to the East African church, a bishop in Uganda who has gone publicly saying that I've got HIV. And as he goes forth in various churches and talking amongst other clergy, it suddenly dawns on everybody that we have a problem and it's our responsibility now.
The church is the answer in terms of HIV and AIDS. I really believe that if the church is not going to get involved, we will never solve the HIV problem. That's both in prevention and in care. That we must, if we can mobilize Christians, we already got the heart and the platform to demonstrate God's love, then we will be able to solve the problem.
Okay, Jim Cantelon, a bishop and a pastor living with AIDS, trying to tell the danger of AIDS.
Mm-hmm. It's not uncommon for pastors to have HIV.
How do they get it?
Well, I think we've got to assume that some of them contract it before they become believers and before they become pastors. But you know, this is a very sensitive issue, Lorna. There's a view of sex in Africa that is quite troubling. It relates to the status of women. Women essentially don't have any real value other than their capacity to serve men. I won't say they're seen as property, but they're almost seen that way. They're very submissive to the will of men. And men pretty much have their way with women, sexually and otherwise. And unfortunately, some pastors who maybe have not been well educated or are new in the faith or for whatever reason are able, because of their influence as authority figures, as leaders in the community, to pretty much have as much sex as they want to have. And I hate to even admit that this is happening, but it does. And I know of one country a country where I'm working, where 50% of the pastors of one denomination are HIV positive. This is a huge issue. This is a huge issue. It's a matter of bringing a biblical perspective on morality and sex, and it's not a change that's going to happen overnight. In fact, one of the sub-themes of this HIV/AIDS initiative of ours is really, you might call it social engineering. We have to create a new values perspective in order for this thing to be dealt with effectively.
Jim, if the usage of women sexually as property is so widespread that it is culturally ingrained. You just shared us these shocking examples from the church, so then I would say society-wide, whether in or out of the church, Muslim, Christian, whatever, secular. What's it going to take to break down something that's held culturally?
Well, I think that the urgency that is beginning to emerge, where everybody's infected or affected in Africa, nobody's neutral anymore. When you have so many funerals happening all of the time, people are starting, just by dint of the numbers of those dying, to acknowledge that maybe they got a problem. And so I think that the horrific statistics, death-wise, are going to force a reevaluation of moral standards on the African culture. And you know, we've got to understand something, that sex everywhere in the world, not just Africa, is seen pretty much as recreation. Even though women have a far greater status here in North America than in Africa, I mean, sexual immorality is rampant here too. And there's HIV/AIDS here too. We have the capacity to stem the tide somewhat with our greater access to drugs and the money that are necessary for drugs. But the fact is that this thing is relentless, and it's just tracking around the world, and to the extent that people are sexually immoral, sooner or later, it's going to catch up with them.
Okay, we need to conclude, because in the next couple of days you're going to be taking us through the 4 pillars of how you feel we need to tackle the AIDS
Awareness,
crisis.
comprehensive education, care and housing infrastructure for children orphaned by AIDS, home-based palliative care. Those are the 4 strategic pillars of what we're doing.
Okay, and Vision Led is the face of AIDS care for the Ministry of Crossroads here, and this is how you can get in touch with Vision Led at Box 460, Burlington, L7R3Y3. That's Reverend Jim Cantillon's ministry, Vision Led, Box 460, Burlington, Ontario, L7R3Y3. Every day this week, Vision Led will be teaching us a different dimension of the AIDS crisis and how we can get involved. Jim, that is a massive prayer need. You know, I know a little bit about the intercessory prayer that went around the globe for the Taliban to fall. And who would have thought in 43 days you could see that regime crushed? It is not beyond the power of God to reach into the miseducation and the immoral situation of sexuality.
There's no doubt. It's going to take a huge effort. Vision-led, we're a startup ministry. We need everything, financial and otherwise. But the point is that if we don't do something, nothing will be done. And we have this, I think, fantastic challenge to make a difference.
All right. Okay, Jim Cantillon will be back later in the hour. And we're going to talk later in the hour also with a Saskatchewan woman whose husband did use her as almost property, an alcoholic, an abusive husband, and a wonderful story of hope and recovery coming up with Betty Reimer. Much more of 100 Huntley Street, including a phone link with David Maines after this.
reading today in Acts chapter 22, verses 17